I still got that buzz and the smells and the atmosphere when you climb into that thing. That's just amazing. The thing just went perfectly. It was just smooth. It was just lovely. It's just very, very gentle and nice to fly. You can see why it got the nickname Gentle Annie.
Welcome to the Series 3 Hangar Talk episode of the Fighting High podcast with me, Steve Darlow. One of the welcome sights at airshows in the UK recently has been Avro Anson Mk.I MH120. Now operated under the auspices of Richard Santos's RAF station Czechoslovakia, the only airworthy Mk.I Anson was originally restored by New Zealand businessman Bill Reid. Recently, I had the chance to speak with Bill, who took me through the journey from acquiring the aircraft and restoring it to wartime condition, to the pride he felt at finally seeing Gentle Annie airborne above New Zealand, and the delight of now seeing her flying at airshows across Europe. But behind Bill's story of the Anson is something more than the restoration of an historic aircraft. It is the story of the men who flew in Ansons, the role these often overlooked aircraft played during the war, and the connection they still provide to those who served. So whether you are an aviation enthusiast, have a family connection to the Anson, or simply appreciate what it takes to bring an historic aircraft back to life, I think you'll find this a fascinating story. This is Anson Reborn, my conversation with Bill Reid. Hello, Bill. Thank you very much for joining me. It's this evening here in the UK, and good morning to you there in New Zealand.
Well, hi, Steve. I hope you're having better weather over there than what we're having. We've got a big southerly front coming through with snow today, so it's not that warm here.
We've had fantastic sunshine, but we'll still moan about that over here because we just do. Bill, before we get into the restoration itself, where did your interest in historic aircraft begin?
Well, I guess you could say I was kind of born into it. Dad was a pilot. He'd flown fighters in World War II, 486 Squadron on Tempest towards the end of the war. Came back to New Zealand, got a job as a chief flying instructor at the local aero club at Nelson, and then started a little airline up from between the two islands with a Miles Gemini. That didn't work out too well. They had a sort of rotten season with weather, and the airstrip that he was flying out of, it was bogged half the time, so he ended up biting the bullet. He'd married Mum in England during the war, and she was keen to get back to the UK, so he took a job flying with BEA on Vikings and DC-3s. And when they started their experimental helicopter unit, they called it, he transferred over to that. Then in 1961, he was offered a job to run a company for an American woman called Eleanor Rudnick back in New Zealand. He knew that helicopters were going to be a pretty big thing in New Zealand, with the rugged terrain that we've got. And came back, and then he ended up buying Eleanor Rudnick out, and Helicopters New Zealand became the largest helicopter operator in the Southern Hemisphere. So I guess, as a child growing up in the UK, I can remember he was based at Gatwick before it was an international airport, and I can, playing around the airfield. There was lots of old wrecks we used to play in, and often would go to Biggin Hill, get work up there sometimes, and always used to take us to the air shows at Biggin Hill and Farnborough. So yeah, I kind of grew up in it, and eventually I ended up leaving school and working for his company in the hangar. Bought a Tiger Moth in 1979, which was my first sort of foray into vintage aircraft, and sort of had that for a couple of years. Then I started my own helicopter business, sort of say for 20, 30 years. We sold the business, my wife and I sold that business in 2002, and I wanted to get back into vintage aircraft restoration work. I had hoped to get a P40, but so the projects that were available, I thought I can't afford those. And so the Ansons came along in Australia, and bought that. Probably could have done two P40s with what it cost me to do the Anson.
And your father, you say he flew operationally on Tempest, but he had his training. He had obviously flown on the Anson.
Yes. Well, he'd actually started flying before the war at the Canterbury Aero Club here in New Zealand, and but he was working as a wool classer. When war came along, he tried to join the New Zealand Air Force, and they wouldn't take him because he said it was an essential occupation, and with our whole economy was based really on wool and sheep. So he managed to. The Royal Navy was out here at the time recruiting for Fleet Air Arm, and he applied for that, got into Fleet Air Arm. They sailed to the UK. This is about 1942 now. When he got there, they said, "No, we've got enough pilots now. We're going to send you to the RAF." So he got sent to the RAF and to Canada, and he had to obviously go through all basic training again. They didn't sort of recognise any civil flying, but once he completed his wings course over in Canada, they kept him back as an instructor for 2 years. He was desperate to get onto operational stuff, and it wasn't until 1944 that he managed to actually get posted back to the UK and into 486 NZ Squadron.
But he had the opportunity to fly the Anson in Canada.
Yes, he did. He did a course. He was basically most of his instructing was on single engines, but he did a twin conversion course, and not long actually before he left Canada to go to the UK. So he did about 60 hours on Ansons there.
And would I be correct in saying that he was able to help you with some of the early stages of the restoration?
He was. He'd retired obviously by the time we got the Anson, but he took a great interest and told me how he loved flying the thing. 486 actually had an Anson on the squadron as well, which they were using as a ferry back to the UK, for flying in parts, replacement pilots and things. And he would sometimes, fly the regular pilot would let him fly that, and he said he really enjoyed it. It was slow. I've got his old logbook, and there's one flight he goes from Volkel back to the Hawker factory to pick up another Tempest, a replacement Tempest. It was like 3 hours 30 flight time from in the Anson back to the UK, and about 1 hour 20 back in the Tempest.
Yes, comparing the two. Yes, goodness. So, how did you come to acquire this particular airframe?
Well, I didn't go looking for an Anson, but it had been advertised, for quite a while, and it looked pretty terrible in the advertising photos. It had been painted up for a movie about the McRobertson air race, the 1934 air race from Milton Hall to Australia. So, and it was representing Roscoe Turner's Boeing 247. So it had had Boeing sort of badges all over it, and all Roscoe Turner's sort of, I think he called it the Comet. So it had a big sort of lightning flash on the side, and the nip and tuck painted on the cowlings, which put the names he'd given to the engines on the thing, on the Boeing. Anyway, it had languished in this museum at a place called Wangaratta, which is about 3 hours drive north of Melbourne. So I sort of a little bit interested in it. I'd made a model, the FX model, when I was about 10 years old, the 172nd Anson. It was one of my favourite models. I don't know why, but I just liked the little gun turret on the top, and it just was different with all its windows. Anyway, I went over and saw this thing and didn't look anything like the FX kit. When I saw it, it had been modified, had little porthole windows. Turret had obviously gone, and had the later model Oxford-style engine cowlings, constant speed props off a Avro 19, and the big spinners, and a different nose on it that had been changed to the freight nose. So yeah, the only thing that sort of bared any sort of resemblance to a regular Anson was the sort of shape of the rudder and fin. But I could see that, with a bit of work, we should be able to get it back. But it kind of relied on two things, and that was being able to get the original bumped cowlings, and most of those had gone by the end of World War II because they'd had issues with exhaust cracking, and so they changed. The airspeed Oxford had a better cooling style of cowling on them, and the constant speed props would have to go, so I'd have to find some original Fairey Reed propellers, and of course the gun turret. And if I couldn't find a gun turret, well, I wasn't really interested anyway. We put an ad out, and there were 5 gun turrets sort of in people's backyards. They'd use them for bird cages, flower pot, glass houses for growing pot plants and things in them. And so we ended up with all in pretty bad shape. But Toby, my son, was helping me on that side of the restoration, and he spent about a year, getting bits of all these 5 turrets and making a really nice one out of them all. So we went to Wangaratta. I saw this thing, and she was sort of sitting over one oleo. It collapsed. She was sort of looking a bit like a lame duck, sort of one wing low and flat tyres. But Terry Brain, who owned the Anson, who was selling it, he'd stored it in the museum for, I don't know, 5 years or so. He was still alive, and he sort of showed me through it. We actually managed to pump the tyres up, get the oleos, put some oil in the oleos, pump them up. Took it outside, and actually after about 3 days we got the thing running, and so I taxied it with Terry, and he sort of told me if you couldn't fly it, obviously. It was sort of, it had been suggested we should fly it back across the Tasman Sea, and I sort of did ponder the idea for a bit, but I'm glad we didn't, because when we eventually got it home, well, pulled it to bits, shipped it home, but when we got it home, there was a lot of sort of frayed control cables, fixes, probably would have let go halfway across the trip, so.
Oh, underneath this, what you saw in Australia, you could see that there was a wartime Anson
Yeah.
that was worthy of taking on board. And would it be correct in thinking that originally you thought this would be about a 3 to 5 year project?
Yeah, that was the plan. Was just to, quick lick of paint and some new fabric and throw the turret in, and we'd be right. But yeah, no, it it took 10 years and sort of and a lot of heartache and a lot of searching around for all the bits and pieces we needed to get it back to looking original.
What was the hardest component, or indeed any other problem to actually overcome?
I think probably that gun turret and the cowlings were the hardest part, really. Propellers, once we'd got it back and, started looking for some propellers, the Australian Air Force Museum at Perth, at Bull Creek in Western Australia, came to the party, and they had 3 Fairey Reed props in reasonably good condition. So we bought those off them and shipped them home and sent them to Safe Air, which is now Airbus, the maintenance facility here in Blenheim in New Zealand. And they put them through the full overhaul process, stripped them back, re-anodized them, and balanced them up, and they came up really well. So the balance of the problem was relatively easy to solve. The engines, now the aircraft had been re-engined with Cheetah 15s, which are the geared engines that the Avro 19s or 12s and 19s had, and the engine looks totally different because it's got a big reduction gearbox on the front of the engine, which is a big bulbous thing, and and it had a bigger crankshaft, so we couldn't fit the Fairey props to it. So we needed to find some Cheetah 9 engines. Now in the museum at Wangaratta, there were 3 big wooden crates in the back of the hangar, and I just casually said to one of the guides there one day, I said, "What's in those boxes?" "Oh," he said, "just some old Cheetah engines." I said, "Oh, that's interesting." And anyway, we managed to find the owner of them who stored them at the museum, and he said, "Oh yeah, that there's these new old stock Cheetah engines," and we thought, wow. So we managed to, have a look inside. Sure enough, they were still, even though they'd been in these wooden crates, they looked pretty dirty and covered in sort of greased oil from years of sitting in backs of hangars and warehouses. But managed to get them at a good price, ship them back here to New Zealand, and Don McKenzie, who worked at Safe Air, he was sort of in charge of their prop shop, but he'd been an engine man prior to that. And he agreed to, strip these things down and have a look. And anyway, he put them through the full overhaul, even though they were new old stock. He put them through the full overhaul process. Found a bit of corrosion in some of the cylinders, which we had to change, and some bearings because they'd sat in one place for so long, it got a bit sort of tight and a bit corroded. So put new bearings in, and yeah, we ended up with, out of the 3, we got sort of 2 running Stereotime Cheetah 9s.
Was there ever a point, Bill, where you thought, I've taken on too much here?
Oh, absolutely. But I I was really fortunate in that, having been in the industry kind of all my life, I knew a lot of engineers and lot of contacts in the industry, and everybody sort of got behind it. And there was some very generous offers of help came along, and I met some wonderful people as well. Like, well, one man in particular stands out, and that was a guy called Cyril Whale. And Cyril had been an aircraft sort of electrician, all his most of his working life, and he overhauled all my components, the mags, the generator, anything electrical on the Anson. He went right through and sort of put back to zero time, and that I wish, he was 92 years old when he died, or when he died not long after the first flight, but he did get to see a fly, and he went for a taxi. He didn't fly with me in it, but he did go for a taxi ride in it, and it was great to let him do that.
It's very much a team effort, isn't it? These sort of projects.
Oh, it was. I mean, I I used to say that, at least 50 people helped me on the project, but I did a presentation recently for the Bring Any Home group in Yorkshire. I think you would have heard about that. And I actually sat down and wrote a list out, and I got to about 120 people that had helped on the project. And it was, like, I couldn't really thank them enough, but yeah, certainly couldn't have done it without them all. I've mentioned Cyril's name, but I should also mention Pete Lacey and Mike Cole, who were the chief engineers on the project. Pete first, but both Mike and I had started work for Pete as sort of apprentices in the sort of mid 1960s, and so we were sort of back together as a team. And I used to joke, well, I used to sweep the floor for Pete back then when I was a kid, and I'm still sweeping it now. My hangar in Wakefield when we were doing this restoration.
I mean, it's clear to me the extraordinary lengths you went to make the aircraft authentic. How important was it to you that this wasn't simply just a flying Anson, but a genuinely representative wartime Anson?
Well, I've sort of been accused of being, a perfectionist and the attention to detail freak. So I guess it was always going to be that way. I, I can remember as a kid in England, Dad took us to the Imperial War Museum in London when it was, well, I suppose it's still there, but when the aircraft before ducks would, and they had this Lancaster nose section there. And I can remember they had sort of steps you could sort of climb up and have a look inside. And that memory has stayed with me. And I think it was something about that made me want to do the Anson and have it looking as it would have done in World War II. There was so much cool air ministry equipment, that adorned these things, all the navigation gear and the bomb sights and the guns and the turrets. It just, something about it just fascinated me, and I guess that's what drew me to want to do the Anson.
And do you think the restoration changed your understanding of what it must actually have been like to operate in an Anson on, for example, coastal command operations?
Oh, absolutely. I think, you know, I everyone's brought up, learning about the fighter squadrons and the bomber squadrons and bomber command, fighter command, and coastal command was kind of the sort of poor relation. But you think really how important that was, and without them, the U-boats would have had just a free reign. And okay, the Ansons, they attacked a few U-boats, and no one actually claimed to sink one, but they certainly kept the things down. They couldn't, any sort of thought that they're going to get spotted from the air, they were, they couldn't really operate, especially in the English Channel and the western approaches. Um, any aircraft, you know, flying around, if the U-boat pops its head out, it's going to get sort of attacked. So they certainly helped that side, that cause of the war.
And you've got crews flying for hours
Absolutely.
in the aircraft, and the navigation's fairly primitive. Communications equipment is fairly primitive as well.
So many were lost coming home, not being able to find their base because they were sent out in terrible weather conditions. One thing about, I don't know whether you noticed on our Anson, it had the early style windscreen, which they stopped making in 1938, went to this more upright version, and I never knew why until I did some research. But the reason was in poor weather, in raining weather and darkness, the water didn't or the lights, the cockpit lights reflected off the sloping glass, and with rain on as well, or they just, they were blind really. They couldn't see where they were going. That's why they went to the more upright version with windscreen wipers and what have you. So, but I really liked that early sloping screen, so that's why we incorporated that on the restoration. I wanted back to how it would have looked as it left the factory, in the war or pre-war.
So 10 years work restoring the aircraft,
Yeah.
and we get to, I believe it was 18th of July, 2012,
Yeah.
and we have the first flight. What's going through your mind?
Well, obviously there's some trepidation. You've done all this work, put all this effort into it. Is it gonna work? Um, but we had a few hiccups on the morning. We'd waited for, we'd had a couple of cancellations due to weather. We wanted it to be in perfect conditions, and we had to tide a lot of people. We had Gavin Conroy, photographer, set up to fly with Jay McIntyre and Dan Chang following us. We wanted to get some air-to-air, shots on the first day, so we had to wait for them to get over. And then we taxied out, and it has been quite a wet winter, July, sort of midwinter here, and it got bogged down in some grass, crossing from a grass area to a concrete area, and it just sank into the ground. Not far, but it was just like a full power on the ground. We just couldn't get this thing out, so I had to shut down. We had all this big crowd there waiting, waiting for this first flight. And it was a bit embarrassing. We sort of climbed out and got a whole heap of friends to push this thing out of this hole in the ground before we could sort of carry on and taxi to the end of the runway to get flying. But from the moment Dave Phillips, who was doing the test flying, I just went along as co-pilot on that first flight because I hadn't done any flying or anything like that. But Dave had been preparing to fly the first Mosquito that Walt Denham at Avspecs was doing. It flew about a month after the Anson, but Dave was quite keen to fly the Anson first, just to sort of get into that, British systems, the same braking systems, and a lot of the equipment's is similar to the Mosquito. Yeah, I mean, the first thing we couldn't believe how quickly it got airborne. It was just like, a couple of 100 meters and we were flying. There's some YouTube video, I think, still up on, the TV crews were there filming us as well. And Toby, my son, was flying a helicopter, getting some air-to-air stuff as well. So it was quite well documented. But it was an amazing feeling, and just, we flew, I don't know, 25 minutes, half an hour or something. And there was just, the thing just went perfectly. It was just smooth. It was just lovely. And Dave was sort of elated. And the only thing that failed was the iPad we had in there for sort of keeping us in the correct airspace, for navigation.
So you got all this restored older technology, and it's the modern technology that lets you down.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's it like to fly the Anson?
I like to compare it with a Piper Cub. That was what I sort of first learned to fly in. And the speeds, the approach speeds and things, believe it or not, are quite similar. Stall speed of the Anson, you know, flaps and gear down, it's only 38 knots. It's like incredibly slow, incredible speed range. And it's just very, very gentle and nice to fly. You can see why it got the nickname Gentle Annie, because they were actually, the Anson, although everyone says, oh, they were just a trainer, they were never designed as a trainer. They were designed as what Avro referred to as a coastal reconnaissance bomber. And I often get into arguments with people who say, oh, why are you calling it a bomber? I said, well, it was. They didn't even fit dual controls to the first sort of batch that were built, because they had to have the access way for the navigator to get up, or the bomber to get up into the nose. They became the staple sort of multi-engine trainer later, or even after war was declared, and the British Commonwealth, their training plan was sort of coming into play. They were selected for that, and that's when they started getting made in much greater numbers. But they were actually criticised as a pilot trainer. They were criticised for being too benign, because they were so sort of easy and relatively good to fly on single, on when they were doing their asymmetric training, that they preferred to use the S.B. Oxfords because they were a lot more squirrely and more prone to ground looping, but they prepared people better for the type, the Mosquitoes, Beaufighters, what have you, that came later. Just a very kind, forgiving aircraft.
You once received a standing ovation of around 50,000 people at an air show.
Oh, that was our first Water air show, yeah.
Yeah. Why do you think this connected with so many people?
I don't know. I mean, I suppose there's been a bit of publicity about the restoration, and Robin, my wife, I haven't mentioned Robin up till now, but she was the sort of driving force behind this restoration. She, obviously, we'd had the helicopter business together, and she'd become very sort of involved in the politics, I guess, of the aviation industry here, and was quite well known. She served on the board of the Civil Aviation Authority, chairman of the helicopter division of the Aviation Industry Association, and she was sort of a popular figure in Wanaka and where the air show was. She was on the board of the trust board of the air show as well. But the, I don't know why. It was pretty amazing to have that many people stand up cheering, clapping after we'd done our display. I think Dave's flying probably helped because he he displayed it amazingly well. I mean, it's not obviously the aircraft's not aerobatic, but it's just what he could do with it was just pretty amazing. He could sort of complete the display within the confines of the airfield. The thing could turn so tightly, and sort of did some steep wing overs and things. And just the people weren't expecting to see an aircraft of that size sort of being, you know, handled that way.
You've said that when you flew the Anson, you thought about the Coastal Command crews who disappeared, and many Bomber Command aircrew trained on Ansons and never came home. My grandfather, I don't know if you knew, he was a Lancaster pilot, a Halifax pilot, and a Lancaster pilot, and so I've got his logbook and the hours that he had flying out with an Anson in Canada. That's why it's very dear to my heart as well. What you're doing. Did flying this aircraft become, in a way, a sort of act of remembrance for you?
It did. I it sort of surprised myself how emotional I got when I sort of think about the 60,000 odd never came home. Most of those guys at some point in their training would have flown in Ansons, whether it was as pilot, navigator, gunners, what have you, most of them would have trained in them. I get so much pleasure out of flying it, and we did quite a few. Once we got the thing flying, we ended up doing commercial flights with it as well, and we call them aircrew experience flights, and they sold quite well. And the people who had, like yourself, had relations that served in Bomber Command during the war or Coastal Command, you could see the emotion in them. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, for the few months that those guys were training, they must have had some great times, experiences. A lot of them, couldn't even drive a car, yet here they were flying aeroplanes and riding around in aeroplanes, which was pretty, if you're not getting shot at, it's a lot of fun. And so they would, I kind of think, well, at least they had this experience before they, met their fate. And, I just, well, I'm starting it now. You get emotional thinking that if it wasn't for those guys and the sacrifices they made, life would have been very different for us all.
Absolutely, Bill. And I personally am very grateful for what you've done because it allows me the opportunity to connect when you're seeing the ants and fly. When we're talking about it, I can connect and I can get a little bit more of an understanding of what my grandfather went through and anyone else, and that the hundreds of thousands of people related to Bomber Command aircrew and Coastal Command aircrew who can now look at the Anson and get a feel of what their ancestor did.
Just to climb up the little ladder and into that cabin is just, I even after all those years and all the work, restoring it and flying it, I still got that buzz and the smells and the atmosphere when you climb into that thing. That's just amazing.
Yes, shivers down the spine, no doubt. But for you, after years of displaying, you eventually decided it was time for the Anson to have a new custodian. So, how difficult was that to let her go?
Oh, it was extremely difficult. But I mean, I knew, I was getting on in years, and for all the, fun we had with it. It was a lot of work, and it became, I guess, an obsession. And I lost Robin to cancer in 2017, which was a bit of a blow, very much a blow. And from that time on, it was like I knew I couldn't keep doing it forever. And I guess the crunch really came in about 2022, 23, and I thought, well, I I want to be sell it while I can still, help whoever buys it to, get going with it, and show them all the little intricacies of operating it, and tips and tricks, which not necessarily in the manuals. Eventually, we advertised it. It took a while to sell. A thing the size of the Anson, it's not like what everyone can sort of fit. You need a fairly decent sized hangar to store it, and a bit of a team to operate it. And when Richard eventually arrived on the scene and showed a bit of interest, I thought, oh, I really would like to have gone to the UK. But Richard came out and met him, and just a lovely guy. And I'd read up on what he'd done with his RAF station Czechoslovakia with the Tiger and the Magister and what have you. And we just sort of got on pretty well. And I thought, no, this guy's good. And he'd promised that he would take it, to shows around Europe, which he's done. And amazed me that I think he did 4 shows in space of sort of just over a week. And the thing is, over there, you've got a lot more opportunity to stay. Here in New Zealand, we only have like 2 or 3 air shows a year, and it's not really enough to make it. Well, it's certainly not enough to make it pay. Whereas you've got the opportunity in Europe to, you can go to a different air show every weekend. Sometimes they say more than that. And he's done that, and I'm so proud of what he's done in displaying it around the European scene. And now he's done 2 trips to the UK with a third one planned, so she's certainly getting the exposure.
And this is Richard Santos,
Yes.
based in the Czech Republic. So now you're seeing your Anson flying at European air shows, and after everything you've put into her, how does that make you feel?
Proud of my team, who really did all the work and just got it to where it is. Yeah, it's nice for them to be able to sort of pick up. She's certainly getting a lot of publicity over there in Aeroplane Monthly magazine and Vintage Aviation Echo have both run big articles on it. I'm sad, I'm sad that I'm not over there to see it, but perhaps next year.
Over here, thank you very much indeed for what you've done, and for Richard for taking it on as well. Because as I say, we now have that opportunity for another connection. It's an overused term, the unsung hero, but what the Anson achieved in terms of actually flying operationally and in terms of training was significant to the success of the air campaigns. So thank you very much indeed, Bill, for everything you did.
Through that period of the restoration, I got a lot of help from people in the UK, from Avro Heritage Group, Air Atlantic, lots of different people. Shuttleworth particularly, they really helped us a lot. So it's nice for them now to see the aircraft as well.
So there's really been a community that's sort of coalesced around the project.
Yeah, and it's been great to be a part of that vintage aviation community as well. I've made lots and lots of friends out of it.
Well, thank you very much, Bill, for that insight, and I look forward to seeing it in the air, hopefully pretty soon. Anything else in the pipeline for you?
Well, I've just bought myself a little de Havilland chipmunk project. I had a bit of a landing accident earlier this year, so I've bought that and have started a rebuild on it. So hopefully within the next sometime in the next year, we'll have that flying, and be some nice cheap flying. And I just get up on a fine day and blow out the cobwebs.
Yeah, so you've still got this sort of romantic love of flying, haven't you? It's still there.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much, Bill, for that insight. Thank you for your time, and very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks for listening to the Fighting High podcast. You can follow Fighting High on X using @FightingHigh. Visit fightinghigh.com for details about books, and follow the Fighting High publishing page on Facebook. If you have enjoyed this podcast, then please follow or subscribe and leave us a review.